Thanks for everybody for attending. We'll walk through the slides and go through my study. The general topic is the named executive officer compensation and company performance, specifically focused on the North American automotive supplier market. My committee is made up of Dr. Peter Bush, Dr. Rich Giannetti, and Ed Stradifacci, if I said that correctly. So the contents of the review will cover the 5 chapters of the dissertation itself. No need to spend time on that. So the statement of the problem. So when you look at the executive compensation, anytime you turn on the news, you can see that it's always highlighted. A couple of recent quotes here from Associated Press. It's up to $14.5 million across S&P 500 companies. Rainey in 22 on the Executive Pay Watch report said something similar, 18 million. I think the other thing that gets a lot of press is that it's increased to 324 times the median worker's pay. And Mischel and Wolf in 2019 noted that the compensation has grown over 50% in the recovery since the downturn in 2019 or in 2009. Well, the annual compensation of basically everybody else grew very little at around 5%. So the question from a longtime finance guy is, so is there a return on that investment of these high salaries? And that's kind of where the study takes its focus. It continues, you read a lot of the pay performance, continues to receive widespread attention with the high pay packages, and then, despite at least certainly in this industry or in this subset of industry, company performance. There's one company in the sample through the years of the study paid out almost $6 million in bonuses, while the stock price, or effectively the return to their shareholders, dropped 32% over the same period. If you look at the literature that exists out there, and I pulled 2 samples here, very inconsistent. Ramgath in 22 noted that performance was a significant determinant of CEO remuneration, while Sturdhar and Jarosha in 21 found basically that it was not, except for ROA, return on assets. So if you go through, we went through the literature, and this is pretty prevalent throughout. Some studies say it's kind of, some studies say it is, and some say it's not. So it's really mixed results. The study, again, is focused on executive compensation, really focused on the short-term component of the executive compensation, so the bonus that is paid every year based on the prior year's performance. I think this line of research here will help improve the understanding of this component and how it links to the company performance, and hopefully enable compensation committees that align it so that they are truly paying for performance. Significance of the study could be significant to the practice by providing additional information. It'll also contribute to better understanding of the relationship specifically in this publicly traded North American auto suppliers, financial and market performance, and how they pay their executives. In addition, it adds to the body of research. So this is a unique in the industry selected. There is a study out there from Marin in 2010 that selected automotive. So it incorporates the OEs in all levels of supply, not one specific to tier 1s in North America. The majority of the research out there is looking at total compensation of executives or the long-term component. So this is unique and adds based by looking at the short-term metric. And also the method, leveraging fixed effects, multiple regression, generally not very common, period, let alone in this particular space. Study came up with 2 research questions. The first one, does a positive relationship exist between executive officer compensation, segregated by the CEO, the CFO, and all the other named executive officers? And we'll cover more on that in a bit. So again, to restart here on the literature review. So it covered these 10 different areas, and we'll cover each one briefly. The history of executive compensation kind of goes back almost 100 years. It kind of first hit the highlights or the media when Bethlehem Steel CEO was forced to reveal he received a bonus of 1.6 million in 1929. So that's kind of the earliest, as noted by Murphy, that it's kind of started to reach prevalence up to in this current proxy season. Each of the public companies now must disclose how compensation aligns with company success over time. So as we get into the review, there's some other shows kind of how historically the popularity of researching this space has grown. Corporate governance, since this study is looking specifically at public companies, it really does cover the compensation committee, which is a subset of the board of directors, and they're the ones responsible for defining and reviewing executive comp. The various components of executive compensation is base salary, the short-term bonus, which this study is focused on, the long-term incentive plan, and then general benefits and perks. Look at what determines executive performance. Scheil and Andre in 2003 noted these were the most popular metrics used, with earnings per share, return on equity being the top two on the financial metrics. And then probably a number of them that we're familiar with as employees, individual objectives and productivity and different targets as the non-financial metrics. Laws and regulations affecting executive comp. So, this covers across lots of things. You remember the Sarbanes-Oxley that came out in the early 2000s is one of them that set different regulations to, as I said, the most recent here on August 25th. The SEC adopted final rules on Dodd-Frank, which really requires companies to disclose how the CEO's compensation aligns with company's success over time, specifically looking at the prior 5-year period. When looking at the company performance metrics, the frequency distribution you see in the Strategic Management Journal and the Academy Management Journal's financial metrics studies, by far and away, return on assets is the most popular one looked at, down to ROS, Tobin's Q, and return on equity, as well as debt to equity inserted in there. Certainly a number of different metrics, but the most popular are there to the left. And if you look at the history on studies on executive comp over the decades and the years, you can see between 1900 and 1950, very little. It started to really ramp up into the 90s and into the current most recent decade, almost 6,000 studies when you look at ProQuest. And it's directly, it does correlate or align, follow a similar pattern as compensation. So as CEO compensation has grown, so has the studies in this space. Studies on firm size and company performance. It's pretty overwhelmingly that, the larger the company, the more ability it has to pay. And so typically you see larger compensation packages in larger companies. And even within this study, you'll see the same thing in the supplier industry. Economic periods. So this study chose to look at it based on auto production in the U.S. and picked a period. I picked a period between 14 and 19, which is relative stability in levels of production. But typically, if you look at the research that's out there, the 5-year period is common. So this one happens to have 6 to capture these titles, but it does align to what we see out in the research. Like I said earlier, the North American supplier industry is this is a unique population. So these are the 15 companies that met their criteria that I used, and we'll cover kind of the criteria as we get into this a bit more. From a theoretical or conceptual framework, really agency is the most popular. It was first discussed by Jensen and Meckling back in 1976. And, it continues to be noted as the most popular and widely used to explain executive comp. And basically what it says is how do you focus on ways to make the governance system of a corporation most efficient so that the shareholders' interest and the performance expectations are realized by both. So if you're going to pay executives more, the shareholders see a return on that investment. The methodology of the study. It was a quantitative-based study based on data collected retrospectively. So since we looked at 2014 to 2019, data already exists. So it just required the retrieval of that data. I ultimately leveraged SPSS for the statistical analysis. It, in my estimation, was better at handling creation of dummy variables and the fixed effects multiple regression when I compared it to SAS and the others. We're leveraging a longitudinal panel data set. I'm going to show an example in a little while. And then, as I mentioned, we're using fixed effects multiple regression, which is a thing that's unique. From the population, so how I got to the 15 public companies, they had, number one, they had to be listed in the top 100 suppliers by Automotive News. So Automotive News annually publishes this, so that's the starting point. They needed to be publicly listed. It ended up that they were either on the New York Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ, or the Toronto Stock Exchange. I also required that they were actively listed on the exchange for all of them. So, this industry has been fraught by takeovers and bankruptcies. So the company had to be publicly listed in proxy statements for the years. That ultimately produced 487 executive records. So across those years, across 15 companies in 6 years, we end up with 487 executives from the proxy statements. 151 of them are actually unique people. Obviously, many of them are repeated throughout multiple years. The data collection, so the study's design relied on secondary data from common archival sources. Retrieved things like Edgar and Setter. So Edgar is where all the companies publish their proxy statements from the US. Setter is the Canadian equivalent. So I had to manually go through and pull the data from those. The compensation data. People intelligence is where I was able to gather some of the demographics that are within the study. And then S&P Global Market Intelligence is accessed through Wharton data retrieval services, and get the financial statements from there. And these are really sources commonly used in quantitative studies where financial data is necessary. Pretty standard set of data. Use the longitudinal panel data set, as I mentioned, from the 15 companies, then 287 executive records and 151 unique. When we describe panel set, you can see here are the 5, for example, a snapshot of the data, are the 5 individuals listed in the proxy statement for Autoliv, ALV, 2014. You can see the company data is repeated for each individual until we get out to the bonus, which is unique, the year born, the gender, and then the decade of their age. So this is extended for each year, each company, each executive, but this is how the data set looks for the panel. The dependent variables, so the CEO, this is the current CEO in the proxy statement. If there is a former CEO listed in the proxy statement, they would have been coded into the NEO category. And then the CFO, similarly, it was the current CFO when the proxy statement was issued. Decade is the age. So you're 53, the decade would be 5, 63, 6, and so forth. Those are a way to group these individuals' ages. And then the non-equity incentive plan, as I mentioned before, was the annual bonus payout. The independent variables, the total assets, that's retrieved from the financial statements, the earnings per share, similarly, return on assets, return on equity. Market value, that was calculated, that was based on the stock price at the end of the year times the outstanding shares. And then Tobin's Q is the relationship between the market value of a company and its total assets. So if you see a Tobin's Q measure below number 1, that suggests that the market value is below what the company's assets are valued at, and vice versa. But this one's, as you saw earlier, is popular in its use. Not necessarily listed in the financial statements, but it is calculatable. From an ethical issues, they're minimal. I use secondary data. There's really no confidential, personal, non-public data was used. There's no human participants. And as I mentioned before, all the data was retrieved from via Wharton Data Services and then Edgar and Setter. I do have extensive knowledge in the industry. I've worked for over 30 years in this particular industry space. I did work for 2 of the companies of the 15 listed, both Dana and Martin Rea. But since it's public data, there's no conflict, nor do I work in the industry or at either of those 2 companies anymore. There's really no conflict of interest because where I'm currently employed is not part of the study. So getting to the findings of the study, so a bit on the demographics of or the description of the sample. You can see from the company, because I chose to have the company must be represented every year. At the minimum, you're going to have 30, which is 5 executives reported for 6 years. And we go to high at Tenneco of 37. And the more turnover a company has, typically you see more of the number, but generally we have above 30 for every company. So it's a good subset of data. Similarly in the years, we did start with gender, but you can see there's really, due to the limited sample, it really wasn't used in the study. And even in the 11 females, it was only 3 unique individuals. So it was really not part of the results. An interesting piece looking at the description is even though I pulled the top 100 suppliers, the variation of metrics is quite substantial. You can see even in total assets from a small side of 164 million to over 25 billion. So even looking at the top 100, there's still quite a variation in results, even in the returns, right? From a 190% return on equity to a loss of almost 50%. Even breaking the company by assets into the groups of over 10 billion and on down, you can see that the bonus follows right along, right? As the company gets smaller, the amount of the bonus on average paid out gets smaller. So wide ranges exist in the financial metrics throughout the data. You look at it by company, same thing. You can see a low of 166,000 to a high of 5 million. Interesting, as we mentioned, Tobin's Q, over half the companies are valued less than their market value is less than their total assets. Maybe indicative of the challenges in this particular industry. Looking at it by title, you can see from the average or the mean, 2.4 for the CEO, and on down to 7 and then up between 7 and almost 900,000 for the rest of the executive team. The max is really driven by one company, and this in fact is their executive chairman who ends up in this grouping, but which drives the max to this level. If you look by year, you can see it was fairly consistent in the first 4 years of the sample, on average paying about $1.2 million per individual. About a 15% drop in 18 to $1 million, and then another drop in 18. You can see kind of how it lines to the production. You look at the companies, you can see at some point in time, at least 7 of the companies paid no bonus. And some very small. But again, a big range. And really it's driven by the outliers of 2 companies. This is of interest of Magna and Linamar. They show in the chart here being as the outliers, and really where it lies is they have chosen to pay a much more significant portion of an executive's total compensation on short-term bonus. You can see where most of them are 2 times down in this space. They're in 8, 10, 12 times the base salary and bonus. But since the study is looking to see whether they earned that bonus or not, this is more of an interest than a factor. To ensure the variability, I went through the 4 tests to ensure that we could run the regression, and they all passed from normality, multicollinearity, heteroscedasticity, and linearity. So all 4 assumptions of the linear regression were met. There are charts in the appendix. I ran a few ANOVAs to see if there's any statistically significant difference between the titles. And between the titles and the earning and the AIP, there was statistically significant differences. Between AIP and year, there was not. So again, when we looked at the previous data, that was, at least for the first 4 years, pretty consistent. So that could be indicative of that they were really consistently paid on average across the study. And between the company, there was a statistically significant difference between the companies. Really, when you focus on the Tukey that I ran, it was really between the same 2 companies that were illustrated before. And in selecting a method to in the regression analysis, I ran 4 different ones: the enter, the stepwise, the forward, and the backwards. And you can see we only got 2 different results. So the stepwise and the forward produced the same results, the same as the enter and the backward. So I selected the enter to use going forward, and it only removed the title of CEO, the dummy variable, and then the decade of the 50s if you're in the age of 50s. And it produced an R value of 634, which according to Shaw in 2020 is deemed as a strong model. But the other 2 were also very, very close. And the results of the F test or the ANOVA here, indicates that the regression model is also a good fit for the data. Here's the multiple regression, the fixed effects regression equation, the AIP, the coefficient, and then the calculation through. You can see through here, right? It is discounting if you have a title of CFO or NEO versus the CEO. That's mainly the difference. The variables selected really explain based on the R squared, 40.2% of the variation. But even in the method chosen, there are still a number of variables that are not significant, indicated by decades, the 2 decades of 4 and 6, ROE, and market value. So this would also indicate that there's another 59.8% of variation represented by other independent variables not included in the model. And as an earlier slide in the literature review noted, it could be individual objective achievement, and we'll cover a bit of that a little bit later. So when we're looking at the first 3 hypotheses, there's a positive long-term relationship between the CEO, the CFO, and the NEO, as a typo, compensation and company performance. The method did further eliminated the market value, the return on the equity, those in the 40s variable, of the dummy variable, and the 6 were eliminated as they were not significant. But the result does lead to the acceptance of all 3 of these alternative hypotheses, as there was a significant relationship between these variables in the model and the AIP paid to these. For the hypothesis 4, 5, and 6, it basically indicates that the total assets significantly affect AIP paid to the company's CEO, CFO, NEO. This result also, the 40% and the R value of 6.34 or 0.634, leads to the acceptance of all 3 alternative hypotheses. And this is really aligned and supports the theory that the larger the company's total assets, the more likely the larger bonuses that are paid to their executives. Individually by title, you can see that the regression equation changes a bit, whereas in the CFO, as I mentioned earlier, there is a 1,285,757 reduction if they hold that title, and similarly down here in the NEO as the difference between the formulas. The investigation involved finding significant linear relationships between the short-term bonus or the IEP for each of the three title groupings and the performance variables as indicated. All research hypotheses were supported. Total assets and earnings per share were positively related, so the higher they were. Tobin's Q, ironically, was negative, so those companies that did not meet the one threshold, actually their bonuses were higher. The impact of age was mixed, and company size did prove to be a significant positive predictor. In summary, the study was principally conducted to investigate the relationship between these named executive compensation analytically and the non-equity incentive payouts and company performance across the 15 companies identified across the North American supplier industry, and look to see which financial or non-financial metrics were most used, and to improve the recognition of the relationship when defining executive compensation in this sector by examining both financial and market performance indicators for these included companies. Moving on to the results. So in summary, again, all 6 hypotheses were supported. The results of the regression indicate, again, as 40% of the variation was explained. So while the results are significant, agency issues could still exist because nearly 60% of the variation is not explained in the study and could be explained by other variables. There are, numerous other plausible explanations. First, you could argue in management power theory that managers can set their own pay, so they're going to set the pay to ensure they get the bonus regardless. Through my experience, number 2 is a common one. The company's performance could be measured against the expectations set through internal budget expectations. So if a company projected to be worse and they made the numbers, even though they projected to be worse, you could still pay out a bonus. That could be a factor. Compensation paid could be determined by how company performs against its peers. Martin Rea does have a factor in their compensation plan that measures how well they performed against their peer group, and that directly affects the size of one of the compensation adders. And lastly, there could be other factors determining executive compensation. A recent analysis of S&P 500 companies found growing interest in linking executive comp to ESG measures. So there could be numerous other things to help explain that 60%. Hypothesis 2 states the same thing as we referred to before, that 40% of the variation in the CFO's pay is explained by the variables in the study. Balsam in 2012 noted that even though the CFOs are not only rewarded when their firms meet or beat targets, but they could also be rewarded for managing earnings and, again, allowing their firms to meet or just beat those targets, so beating industry expectations. There could be other factors affecting the CFO like this. In terms of the everybody else or the NEO, similar result. And I think most recently, if you watched, those of us in the Detroit area, on February 3rd, Ford Motor Company released its 4th quarter earnings or results and said they did not meet expectations. And in fact, they even communicated they left $2 billion on the table of excess cost. Yet the Ford salaried workers, including the executives, are still eligible to earn 140%, 48% of their performance bonus. So even though they had what would be deemed a very poor quarter, they're still paying a good bonus. Hypothesis 4, 5, and 6 that stated there's a statistically significant positive correlation between the 3 titles and firm size as measured by total assets was also supported. And this really just attributes the phenomena to, larger companies, larger increased complexity requires a higher skilled, experienced executive. And at the same time, large firms typically have the ability to pay more just by sheer terms of economies of scale and market power. So from implications, the executive compensation literature and agency theory has abundance of controversy regarding the relevant studies. Again, lots of mixed results, no matter what industry or what country was covered in the population. This study was built on prior research and on whether the North American auto suppliers are compensated in line with the metrics of the study. If the executives are paid more when the company performs better, then the results would be aligned with agency theory. And the results of the study do suggest that the executive compensation has a significant relationship with both company size and performance. Limitations. So the study was only focused on a small subset of 15 of these companies with strict criteria. The study also specifically selected a period of stability in the industry, which could limit the results. The study was also limited to the financial metrics selected. If you saw some of the earlier charts in the literature review, there are a multitude of metrics that could be selected. And the compensation data was downloaded from People Intelligence, which ultimately turned out to be very limited in its completeness and accuracy. So, which required me to pull it one by one from each of the company's proxy statements. So, if we increase the size of the companies in the pool, it would exponentially increase the amount of work to pull that data. Some recommendations for the future. So again, since it was limited to just this subset of companies, we could try to expand the sample size to include companies on other stock exchanges, whether it's including the foreign listings, but also introduce private companies if the data is retrievable. The same study, you could do the same study over more than 6 years, possibly incorporating the front or back end of the period I selected, which would have both downturn, which would have the results of the economic downturn in 2009 coming out of it, and then the COVID impact of 2020. Or you could pick an additional second period and compare the periods together. There is some, in the literature review, there is some support for that. Unfortunately, with this industry, if I picked another period of stability, half these companies weren't listed, so it made it not a good comparison. So I chose to pick it here, but we could try. Whoops. Study could be enhanced by including other metrics that gauge the company's performance to market or market expectations. Most public companies produce guidance, so you could try to measure the actual results versus their guidance, and did they achieve guidance or not, and include that in the study as another opportunity. So overall, special thanks to and recognition to my committee for their support and guidance throughout this, what turned out to be a year-long journey. I think it does say a lot to make sure you have a committee you can get along with and work with, and it did make the process very smooth. That overall, that was the summary of my study. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Kevin, very much. Excellent work. So, questions. So, anyone that's in the presenter link, which is just the committee, and I think who else is on there right now? Dave Lyman, you're in here, so you could ask a question directly. Those of you that are in the attendee link cannot ask a question directly. However, if you have a question for Kevin, you can input it into the Q&A section of Blue Jeans, and I will ask it on your behalf. So, does anybody have any questions?
So, surprise, I got a question. So, Kevin, this is pretty cool. Good for you. So, how are you going to use this?
Yeah, I'm not sure, right? I mean, because again, it's just change. My work situation changed, right? So I was in one of these companies when this whole
Yeah, you were.
process started 3 years ago, and we used that company in one of the studies for your course. Now I'm in a company that with 58 people, and it
Right.
really doesn't apply. So, but it is of interest, right? I mean, I think when I go back to my most recent experience, that company in particular, which drove this interest, had different bonus plans. So those of us that were corporate employees were paid based on whether we made budget, and those that were in operations were paid based on how much profit they made. So there are cases where we didn't make budget, and so those of us corporate employees didn't get bonus, but yet the operating folks got nice ones because they still made profit. They got a percent of it. So I'm not sure the answer at this point.
So when you started this, what was your goal for the dissertation? What I mean, you did, this is very well done and all that, but what was your goal in doing it besides, I'm going to say, check the box? There was clearly more than that. But what did you want to get out of it?
Well, I wanted to see if there was a way, if it really did correlate to metrics beyond just achieving budget or not achieving budget, and was there a correlation in this particular, because I spent my whole life here.
You had the hypotheses were basically all confirmed. Did you think they would be, or what? What about that other 60% variance? I'm sure you gave some thought to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm a bit surprised, and maybe it's only from my limited experience, because even at my first company I spent a long time with, bonus got paid based on whether you made budget or not, right? So if you're forecasting a downturn in the industry and you still made those numbers, even though they're worse year over year, you still got paid. So I am a bit surprised that it aligned as much as it did. I'm not surprised about company size, right?
Yeah,
But
that made sense.
The selection of those metrics, because so much of it, even that Ford example, right, which is crazy to me, right? They're still going to pay big bonuses even though they blew the quarter. So they must have expected, the skepticism in me, they must have expected to blow the quarter when they set their bonus plan.
Somebody had a guess, right? Interesting. That's cool. I'm not sure, for me personally, if I would have predicted that there would have been that kind of alignment. I mean, that says something about, in quotes, the legitimacy of the boards,
Mm-hmm.
except for the outliers. So that's cool. That's very cool. That's good news, actually.
Yeah, I think so.
All right, Kevin, I've got a question from Dr. Perez. So the first one, if you were to redo this study, how might you conduct the study differently?
Conduct the study differently. I think I would try to figure out a better way to get more companies into the pool. Because if you think about it, I only had 15 out of 100.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm not sure that's possible, because I don't know if you can get some of that, some of the very, very large companies are foreign based and a number of them are private. So I'm not sure we could gather the same data, but I think it would definitely be worth a shot to have a bigger population.
Certainly a challenge. I mean, Christine and I have been talking about that as well for hers, right? And just trying to be able to get at the data is challenging. So Dr. Perez has one more. What, if any, were the unanticipated outcomes of your study, and what surprises have you come away with, if any?
I think that when you looked how the two companies outlined, right, that they're paying 8 to 10 times the base salary. And, I've heard that my brother works at Magna, and so does my son. So I've heard that throughout the process here, that they do pay. I mean, like, their executives are making $350,000 base, but they're getting $10 million bonuses, right? So it was kind of surprised by that.
I think we were in the wrong places, Kevin. But
Yeah.
anyway, I was surprised to see that myself, having been along the same boat with you. Like, wow, that's
Right.
that was in the wrong company.
And
All right, so-
I noted it. I noted at the beginning the one company that continued to pay bonuses even though their stock price crashed. Right, they were a direct competitor of Martin Reyes, so we paid close attention to them. So that's kind of, I wasn't surprised about that one. No.
the
And the
industry's
CEO
on.
is still employed. It's still the same CEO through that whole period of time.
That's pretty amazing, actually.
And then you got
I've
other
got one more.
companies. You got other companies that every year there's a whole different list of people. So
Yeah, right. All right, I've got one more from Russell for you. Do you feel that once your study is published, that some industry types will use it? And would you? I mean, because you've been in, the C-suite, you've been on that side of the shop. I mean, would you look at a study like this and think there's practical value to it?
I think so. I think you could focus it in on, the metrics of your specific company itself, right? For example, my last one, they pay strictly as your contract says you get 0.25% of net income. So you're getting strictly paid off of net income, which can create some bad behaviors and pressures for the finance folks, if you know what I mean, right? To inflate the earnings. So I think this would help make it more well-rounded, maybe introduce more metrics if you're going to pay off of results versus off of a budget.
Yeah, agreed. All right, thank you. So last chance, anybody else want to ask a question from either live in the participant link or through chat?
So what kind of long-term comp programs did they have? Like performance shares or STARS, or what kind of things did they have?
I can speak to the two. They had both had perform PSUs and RSUs.
Okay.
Martin Rea had a stock match, so 50% stock match to help get you there.
Okay.
And then they also had the PSUs and RSUs, and those were paid based on how well you did against your competition or your peer group, right? So again, you could have a crappy year as long as you beat your peer group, then they would still pay at the higher rates.
Was there a delay? Some of the performance shares I'm familiar with, they're over a period of time, based on an average return or whatever their metric is that they're using. But there's a period of time that defines that.
Yeah, most were matured over 3 years.
Okay, that was my question. Okay. Interesting.
You get a third, basically.
And it was rolling as long as you were there, but there was the wait for the payout, right?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
Yeah. Hasn't changed much.
No. But there, if you look out and like in the reason, a lot of people looked at that space. So that's why I tried to focus in on, okay, did you perform in the year and how did it get paid?
The cash, yeah.
Yeah.
There were a lot of studies done years ago on the performance shares thing. I remember some of them. Well, congratulations. Good job.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Kevin. This is Rich.
Hey, Rich.
Congratulations, by the way. Quite an
Thank you.
accomplishment, and it was a pleasure working with you this last year. I have a question, but it has nothing to do with your topic because I worked with you all year on this. But seeing that a number of your colleagues, your classmates from your cohort are in this call, what advice would you give to them after having gone through this journey so that they could be as successful as you were?
I think it starts from Peter's advice at the very beginning is pick something you think you can get done, right? Don't invent the wheel. So here, I picked public data, right? So you did not have to go through interviewing people or taking surveys or anything like that. So I think that certainly helped the cause here. And then, not that maybe it's not a recommendation, but I had to take some catch-up hours because my MBA was so long ago. It didn't have that have enough hours to graduate this degree. So we started working and exploring this space back then. So that's what kind of helped well. And I think picking a committee that, you know, you can get along with and work with, right? I mean, Peter and I had a relationship from before, so that was an easy one. And then finding, you know, me specifically looking for people that had both professional and educational background. And then I think that helped work well with me, and you speak somewhat of the same language.
I just wanted to say congratulations, and you know what I was really impressed with was we had been talking about the stats, and that's something I teach, and I like that you used the fixed effects. That was really just all the other issues, heteros, that wasn't possible, cadasticity, and you know, multicollinearity, and I'm looking forward to seeing if you're going to do more with this. I'd like to work with you on that. I'll just help you out. But so yeah, agency theory is important. The question comes up constantly, and to see it in a micro sense, this particular industry is really.
And I think the other piece, and maybe that's just the, sorry, thanks, Ed. I think the other piece is, you know, at least through the first 3 chapters, I kind of project managed myself, because you really didn't have assignments to get done every week, right? And so I kind of built my own chart like a project manager would, and I need to get this done by this time. And you know, it wasn't strict, but at least it kept stuff in front of me, and even stuff in front of where we needed answers from the committee and stuff like that. So that was helpful at the beginning as well. This has to get done. These are the things I got to do. I even kept the chart that I wanted to make sure I at least put in 10 hours a week. And I would try to roughly track my hours so that I know I was at least putting in the time. So that helped. Now, I didn't do that after chapter 3. We were kind of rolling at that point. But that helped, right? I had something for myself to look at.
All right, so I don't see any more questions.
One more comment, and then you know, I discovered the use of a number of tools. Zotero was one of the main ones, which fantastic for downloading research and storing it and categorizing it. And then there's also an add-in to Word, so it does your citations for you. Not perfectly, but pretty damn close. And so that helped, that kind of the how to organize, move along very quickly.
Awesome, thank you. Russell has one more comment, which is a good one, which he says, congratulations, Kevin, for being the #1 in the cohort and #1 in reaching the finish line. So you are #1 in many categories here. So that's very.
I appreciate it.
All right, so next step here. So first, I want to thank all the attendees for coming and supporting Kevin today. So thank you very much. So I'm going to ask everyone other than the committee to step off this call, including you, Kevin. I will text you in a few to come back in. So thank you all for joining today, and certainly it's exciting to have our first student come through the process here. So exciting day for all of us. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay.